The weight of a legacy is a strange and heavy thing. It's not something you can see or touch, but it settles on your shoulders from birth. For me, it was the weight of my grandfather's hands, calloused and strong from building a manufacturing empire out of nothing but grit and foresight. It was the weight of my father's prudence, his quiet, meticulous stewardship of that empire, transforming my grandfather's raw success into a stable, enduring fortune through conservative investments and a deep-seated fear of risk. And then there was me. I inherited the result of all their hard work, the final, polished product. I never knew the struggle, only the security. My hands were soft. My life was a comfortable, predictable glide path, managing a portfolio of blue-chip stocks and municipal bonds, a task that required more patience than genius. I was a caretaker, a custodian of a past I hadn't built and a future that seemed preordained. My wife, the love of my life, had married into this security. She trusted my financial judgment implicitly because the numbers always went up, slowly, reliably, like a well-tended garden. Our life was a testament to this steady growth. We lived in a sprawling house my grandfather had built, a solid, unpretentious mansion of brick and oak. Our children, a son and daughter, attended a private school that cost more per year than most people's salaries. We had the right friends, the right vacations, the right kind of quiet, understated wealth. But a quiet life can be a breeding ground for a certain kind of dangerous ambition. I was a king of a realm I hadn't conquered, and a part of me, a deep, unacknowledged part, felt like a fraud. I yearned to make my own mark, to do something bold, to show the ghosts of my father and grandfather that I was more than just a careful manager. I wanted to be a builder like them, but I didn't know how to build anything except a spreadsheet. The opportunity, when it arrived, didn't feel like a risk. It felt like destiny. It was a small biotech startup called Sparrow, the Latin word for hope. A friend from my country club, a man who had made a fortune in venture capital, couldn't stop talking about them. Sparrow was on the verge of a breakthrough, a revolutionary new drug that targeted the root cause of early-onset Alzheimer's. The science was complex, but the story was simple and powerful. They weren't just chasing profits, they were chasing a cure. They were selling hope in a bottle. I started researching them, falling down a rabbit hole of press releases, scientific papers I barely understood, and interviews with their CEO. He was a charismatic, brilliant scientist who spoke with the fervor of a prophet. He painted a picture of a future free from the scourge of a terrible disease, and a future where the initial investors, the true believers, would be rewarded with unimaginable wealth. I started small. I took a portion of our discretionary funds and bought a block of Sparrow's stock. I didn't tell my wife, framing it in my mind as a minor, speculative play. But then the stock began to climb. The early trial data was promising, and with each positive news release, the share price jumped. The feeling was intoxicating, a chemical rush that the slow, steady growth of our main portfolio could never provide. This was active, thrilling. This felt like building something. I mentioned it to our family's longtime financial advisor, a man my father had hired 30 years ago. He was the embodiment of caution, a man who viewed the stock market not as a place to get rich, but as a place to not get poor. He looked at Sparrow's prospectus with deep suspicion. He spoke of fundamentals, of price-to-earnings ratios, of the incredibly high failure rate of biotech startups. He advised me to sell, to take my modest profit, and reinvest it in a diversified index fund. "This isn't investing, my boy," he said, his tone gently condescending. "This is the roulette wheel." His prudence felt like an anchor in an age of rocket ships. The world was changing, and he was being left behind. While my Sparrow stock had doubled in 3 months, his carefully managed portfolio had yielded a respectable but boring 2%. I saw him not as wise, but as timid. I stopped taking his calls. My investment in Sparrow grew. I sold off a chunk of our blue-chip stocks, the bedrock of our fortune, to buy more. Each time I clicked the buy button, my heart hammered with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. I was moving beyond the boundaries my father had set, sailing into uncharted waters. My wife noticed the new energy in me, the obsessive way I checked my phone for stock market updates. I told her I was simply taking a more active role in our finances, making some strategic adjustments to increase our income. She smiled and trusted me. Why wouldn't she? I was the custodian, the one who understood this world. I was the man who had always provided. The moment of madness, the point of no return, came when Sparrow announced a date for the release of their final Phase 3 clinical trial results. This was the big one. FDA approval was on the line. The online forums were electric with hype. Analysts were predicting the stock would jump tenfold overnight. This was it, the moment to make my mark. The moment to multiply my grandfather's legacy, to elevate our family from merely wealthy to stratospherically rich. A voice in the back of my head, a voice that sounded a lot like my father's, screamed at me to stop, to cash out, to be content. But another voice, a louder, more seductive one, whispered that greatness required boldness, that fortunes were made by taking the risks that timid men avoided. I made the decision in a cold sweat in the middle of the night. I didn't just want to be rich. I wanted to be right. The next morning, I did the unthinkable. I logged into our portfolio, the digital vault that held the work of generations, and I started to sell everything. The shares in rock-solid industrial companies my grandfather had bought, the municipal bonds that had weathered a dozen recessions, the real estate investment trusts that provided a steady, reliable passive income. I liquidated our entire history. It took a few hours, a few clicks of a mouse. An entire lifetime of work turned into a single massive pile of digital cash. My financial advisor called, his voice frantic, pleading. I didn't answer. I transferred the entire sum into my trading account and placed a single massive market order for shares of Sparrow, all in. I had bet our past, our present, and our future on a single spin of the wheel. For a few hours, I felt a dizzying, terrifying sense of power. I was a titan of industry, a visionary. I was no longer the caretaker. I was the creator. I had taken control of my destiny. The day the results were announced, I locked myself in my home office. I had a bottle of ridiculously expensive champagne on ice ready for the celebration. The news was scheduled to be released after the market closed. I watched the stock price all day, the ticker a flat line of anticipation. The final bell rang. The market closed. I refreshed the news feed, my hand shaking. And then the headline appeared. It wasn't the one I was expecting. Sparrow drug trial fails, FDA rejects application due to safety concerns. The words didn't compute at first. It was a mistake, a typo, but then the details emerged. The drug wasn't just ineffective, it had caused severe liver damage in a significant number of patients. It was a catastrophic failure. I switched to my trading account, watching the after-hours market. The stock had been halted. Then it reopened. I watched the number, the one that represented our entire net worth, dissolve. It plunged 50%, then 70%, then 90%. It didn't stop falling until it was trading for pennies a share. The work of my grandfather, the prudence of my father, our home, our children's future, all of it gone, vaporized in 90 seconds. I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen, the champagne warming on the desk beside me. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of a tomb. I had a legacy to protect, and I had single-handedly destroyed it. The hardest part was not the loss of the money. It was the walk I had to take from my office to the living room where my wife was reading a book, blissfully unaware that our world had just ended. I had to look into the eyes of the woman who trusted me completely and tell her that I had gambled away everything she had ever known. The weight of my legacy was gone, replaced by the crushing, unbearable weight of my own guilt. Her first reaction was not anger, but a profound, almost childlike confusion. She looked at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. "What do you mean it's gone?" she asked, a small, nervous laugh in her voice, as if I were telling a joke in very poor taste. I tried to explain, my words clumsy and inadequate, stumbling over terms like clinical trials and market volatility. But all she heard was the simple, brutal truth. The money that had defined her entire adult life, the bedrock of security upon which we had built our family, had vanished. The confusion in her eyes slowly curdled into a dawning horror. The book slipped from her fingers and landed on the plush carpet with a soft thud. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stared at me, her face pale, her expression one of utter devastation. In that moment, I saw her love for me fracture. The trust that had been the cornerstone of our marriage, the unspoken faith she had in my competence, was shattered. She was looking at a stranger, a reckless, foolish stranger who had set fire to their home. That night was the beginning of the end of our old life. The consequences came swiftly, like a series of aftershocks after an earthquake. The first was the call from the bank. The mortgage payment on our house, a transaction that had been automatic for years, was declined due to insufficient funds. Then the credit cards, the private school, the utilities. The intricate architecture of our finances, once a fortress, was now a pile of rubble, and the creditors were the first scavengers to arrive. We had to sell the house. There was no other choice. The process was a public vivisection of our failure. An estate sale was held, and strangers walked through the halls where our children had grown up, placing bids on our furniture, our art, our history. I watched as a man haggled over the price of the grandfather clock that had chimed in the hall of my memory for my entire life. Each item sold felt like a piece of my identity being stripped away. My wife walked through the emptying house like a ghost. She had fallen into a deep, silent depression. The vibrant, capable woman I had married was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out version who barely spoke and moved with a heavy, listless gait. There was no we anymore. There was only her pain and my guilt, two separate, toxic entities living in the same space. I was the source of her misery, and my presence was a constant, agonizing reminder of what she had lost. The children were the deepest collateral damage. Pulling them out of their school was one of the hardest things I have ever had to do. They lost their friends, their teachers, their sense of stability, all in one blow. We moved into a small, two-bedroom rental apartment in a part of town I used to drive through with the doors locked. The walls were thin, the air smelled of stale cooking, and the sound of sirens was a constant soundtrack. My son, who was 12, became sullen and angry. He understood on a basic level that I was to blame. He looked at me with a new, unsettling contempt. He had worshipped the man I used to be, the provider of his privileged world. He despised the man I had become. My daughter, who was 8, was just sad and confused. She missed her room, her pony, her life. She would ask me when we were going home, and I had no answer for her. I was drowning in guilt. It was a physical presence, a weight on my chest that made it hard to breathe. I couldn't sleep. I would lie awake on the cheap mattress on our new bedroom floor, the sounds of my wife's quiet weeping a form of torture, and I would replay my monumental mistake over and over again, a looped film of my own stupidity. I needed a job. For the first time in my life, I needed to earn a living. My resume was a joke. Portfolio manager for a private family trust. What did that even mean in the real world? I had no skills, no trade. My entire life experience was in managing a fortune I no longer had. I was useless. One afternoon, sitting in the bleak, anonymous living room of our apartment, I saw a commercial on the small television. It was for a truck driving school. A gravelly-voiced narrator spoke of freedom, of the open road, of a steady paycheck, and a new career in a matter of weeks. It showed a massive, powerful truck rolling down a sun-drenched highway. It was the antithesis of my life, of the silent, suffocating apartment where I was rotting from the inside out. It was a world of physical reality, of tangible work. It felt like a penance, a way to do something, anything, to atone. I took the last of the money we had from selling my wife's jewelry. She had handed it to me in a small velvet bag, her hand trembling without saying a word, and I enrolled. The school was a culture shock. I was a decade older than most of the other students and came from a different planet. They were rough, loud, working-class men, their hands already calloused, their faces etched with lives of struggle I couldn't imagine. I was soft, pale, and terrified. They looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Learning to drive an 18-wheeler was the hardest thing I had ever done. The sheer size and power of the machine was intimidating. I struggled with the gears, with backing into a tight spot with the feel of the air brakes. My instructor, a grizzled, patient man with a tobacco-stained beard, told me I was the worst student he'd ever had. "You think too much," he'd say. "You can't think your way out of this. You gotta feel it." But I was driven by a desperate, all-consuming need. This wasn't a career choice. It was an act of survival. Failure was not an option. I studied harder, I practiced longer, and I slowly, clumsily began to get it. I began to feel the truck, to understand its rhythms, its immense, rolling momentum. The day I passed my commercial driver's license test, I felt a surge of pride I hadn't felt in my entire life. It was the first thing I had ever truly earned on my own. It wasn't a legacy or an inheritance. It was a license, a plastic card that said I could do something useful. I got a job with a long-haul company, a bottom-tier outfit that took on new drivers no one else would. The pay was terrible, the trucks were old, and the routes were punishing. My first assignment was a 3-week haul from New Jersey to California and back. I packed a duffel bag, kissed my sleeping children goodbye, and said a stilted, awkward farewell to my wife. The look in her eyes was not of pride or hope, but of a weary resignation. As I climbed into the cab of my assigned truck, the air thick with the smell of diesel and stale coffee, I felt a profound sense of despair. I had gone from a mansion to this rumbling metal box. I was leaving the family I had destroyed to go wander the country alone. It wasn't the open road of freedom from the commercial. It was the road of exile. The first few months on the road were a special kind of hell. The loneliness was a physical entity, a constant, heavy presence in the passenger seat. The cab of the truck with its cracked dashboard and worn-out seat was my entire world. It was my office, my kitchen, my bedroom, my prison. The rhythmic drone of the engine and the endless ribbon of asphalt became the soundtrack to my self-flagellation. For hours, for days, there was nothing to do but drive and think, and my thoughts were merciless. I would dissect my failure from every angle, replaying the moment I liquidated our legacy, the look on my wife's face, the confusion in my children's eyes. The guilt was a tireless passenger. At truck stops, I was an alien. I would sit in a booth at a diner, surrounded by other drivers, men who seemed so at ease in this world. They would talk and laugh, their conversations a mix of trade talk, family news, and crude jokes. They were a tribe, and I was an outsider. I would eat my meal in silence, feeling their curious glances, and retreat back to the solitude of my cab. But slowly, imperceptibly, something began to shift. The road, which had been my tormentor, started to become my teacher. Staring out the windshield for 12 hours a day, I began to see the country in a way I never had from the window of an airplane or the curated comfort of a luxury resort. I saw the vast, heartbreaking beauty of the Utah desert at sunrise, the quiet dignity of the Kansas prairie, the raw, industrial power of the cities I delivered to in the dead of night. I was no longer looking at a map of assets. I was looking at America. I was a tiny, insignificant part of its massive, circulatory system, hauling the goods that kept it alive. I started to appreciate the work for what it was. It was hard, demanding, and essential. I was doing something real. I wasn't moving numbers around on a screen, I was moving freight. I learned the value of $1 in a way I never had before. Every cent I earned was the result of a mile driven, a crate unloaded, a deadline met. I would send my paycheck home every week, and the act of doing so was a small, concrete act of redemption. It wasn't a fortune, but it was honest money, earned through my own sweat and exhaustion. My relationship with my family began to change, mediated by the distance and the static of a phone line. The calls home became my lifeline. In the suffocating proximity of our small apartment, my guilt and my wife's depression had created a toxic, unbreathable atmosphere. But with 1,000 miles between us, we could finally talk. I would call from a rest stop in Wyoming, the wind howling outside my cab, and I would just listen. I asked about the kids' schoolwork, about the leak in the apartment ceiling, about her day. I stopped making promises I couldn't keep. I just listened and offered my support, a steady voice on the other end of the line. She began to talk back. She told me about her struggles, her fears, her small victories. She told me she was looking for a part-time job. I could hear a new strength in her voice, a resilience I hadn't heard in a long time. She was no longer just the victim of my failure. She was a survivor, building a new life for herself and our children. The other drivers started to talk to me. They learned I was quiet but reliable. A driver named Sal, a man in his late 50s with a booming laugh and a picture of his grandchildren taped to his dashboard, took me under his wing. He taught me the tricks of the trade, the best places to eat, the shortcuts to avoid traffic, how to talk to a difficult dispatcher. One night, broken down on the shoulder of I-80 in Nebraska, my engine dead, I thought I was done for. It was 2 in the morning and I was in the middle of nowhere. I called Sal, who was 100 miles away. He turned his rig around and drove back to help me. He spent 4 hours with me in the freezing cold, his hands covered in grease, helping me diagnose the problem and get the engine running again. When we were done, I tried to offer him money. He just laughed and slapped me on the back. "We're truckers," he said. "It's what we do. You do the same for me." In that moment, I finally felt like I belonged. I was a trucker. I was part of the tribe. It was an identity I had earned, not inherited. It was built not on wealth, but on work and mutual respect. I had lost a fortune, but I was discovering a different kind of value, a different kind of insurance. It was the value of human connection, of showing up for someone when they need you. I drove long haul for 2 years. 2 years of sunrises and sunsets seen through a bug-splattered windshield. 2 years of greasy diner food and sleeping in parking lots. 2 years of missing my family with an ache that never truly went away. But it was in that rolling monastery of solitude and labor that I began to heal. I forgave myself, not for the mistake, but for the arrogance that led to it. I let go of the ghosts of my father and grandfather, not their memory, but the crushing weight of their expectations. I was not them. I was my own man, a man who had failed spectacularly, but who was slowly, painfully learning how to be a good man, not just a rich one. I was finally ready to go home. Coming home for good was a quiet, anticlimactic affair. There were no fatted calves or grand celebrations. I simply took a local driving job, a position hauling gravel for a construction company. It was dusty, noisy work, but the hours were regular, and the most important detail was that I got to sleep in my own bed every night. The man who returned was not the same one who had left 2 years earlier. The softness was gone, replaced by a lean, wiry strength. My hands were permanently calloused, and there were new lines etched around my eyes. But the biggest change was on the inside. The frantic, anxious energy of my old life, the constant need for more, had been replaced by a quiet calm. I had seen the bottom, and I had survived. There was a peace that came with knowing that. Our family had found its own new normal. My wife had gotten a job at the local library, a position she loved. It didn't pay much, but it gave her a sense of purpose and independence she hadn't had before. She was no longer just the woman who had lost a fortune. She was a woman who was building her own life. The kids had adjusted too. They were resilient. My son, no longer sullen and angry, was a thoughtful teenager who had learned the value of hard work from watching his parents. My daughter was a happy, creative child who found joy in simple things. We were a family again, not a portrait of wealth, but a real, functioning, sometimes messy family unit. We lived in a small, rented house with a patchy lawn and a dripping faucet. Our budget was a constant topic of conversation, a puzzle we worked on together. We had debts that would follow us for years, a permanent reminder of my folly. But our home was filled with a warmth and an easy laughter that our mansion had never had. We had lost our passive income, but we had found an active life. I was more of a father than I had ever been. I was there for parent-teacher conferences and soccer games. I helped with homework at the kitchen table, my large, clumsy hands struggling with their delicate school projects. I was present in a way that my money had previously allowed me not to be. My relationship with my wife was rebuilt, not on the shattered foundation of our past, but on a new, more honest ground. We were partners in a way we never had been. We didn't have the luxury of unspoken assumptions anymore. We had to talk, to negotiate, to rely on each other for everything. One evening, we were sitting on our small, rickety back porch, watching the kids play a makeshift game of baseball in the yard. The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and pink. We didn't have a view of the city skyline or the ocean. We had a view of a chain-link fence and our neighbor's overflowing recycling bin. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked, her voice quiet. "The old life." I thought about it for a moment. I thought about the bespoke suits, the fine dining, the effortless security, and I realized with a startling clarity that I didn't. "I miss the security for the kids," I said honestly. "But I don't miss the man I was. He was an empty suit, terrified of not measuring up. He was a caretaker of a museum, not a participant in his own life." She reached out and took my hand. Her hand was no longer perfectly manicured. There was a small smudge of ink on her finger from her work at the library. My hand was rough, a faint smell of diesel permanently ingrained in the skin. We were no longer a polished, perfect couple. We were two people who had been through a storm and had found a way to hold on to each other. "I like this man better," she said softly. I learned that my grandfather's legacy wasn't the money. It was the work ethic. It was the grit. It was the understanding that a life is built, not inherited. I had to lose the fortune to finally understand the inheritance. My life is small now, and it is measured in simple, tangible things. The rumble of my truck's engine in the morning, the smell of dinner when I come home, the sound of my children's laughter, the quiet comfort of my wife's hand in mine. I am no longer a rich man. I am a truck driver, a husband, a father, and I have never, ever felt wealthier. Now that you've heard what I went through, I'd love to hear from you. What's the one choice you made in a painful moment that ended up changing your life for the better? Comment below, and make sure to subscribe.